And good morning, everybody. We are recording. We're live on Facebook. We're all good things.
Excellent. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. We are, as advertised, and my apologies for advertising it very late, but with all the teaching stuff going on, I forgot. And then at the last minute went, Gah! So, but we're going to be talking about the so-called first 100 days, or really why the beginnings of presidencies matter so much, and some of what people have thought about them before and how that helps or doesn't help us. We're far from the first 100 days, but it seemed we're at a beginning moment, and beginnings matter. So that was the sort of reasoning behind what we're talking about today. But before we go into that, I must ask my partner in crime, Matt, to please explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to History Matters and So Does Coffee. Rules of the game are as follows. We encourage you to use the chat function to have a good, robust, exciting conversation while Joanne and I, depending on the time of your conversation, are talking. We like to see what you all are saying, so it is always fun to do that. As always, though, please make sure that you keep it germane to the conversation and, of course, family friendly. And as Tom reminds us, please make sure that you select all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see us or see what you say. Excuse me. If you do have questions, and we do like questions, plenty of questions, as many questions as possible, please put those in the Q&A. It's a lot easier for us to keep track of who's asked what and when if we use the Q&A function, and then it doesn't clog up the chat with questions for Joanne, which are going to be scrolled past and we're not going to be able to see them. So let's make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A. And as always, my weekly threat stays alive and well, which is if you don't put questions in, poor Joanne is going to have to suffer through all of my questions, which is...
That's a fake threat is what that... But you can make it every week.
I enjoy making it every week.
Yeah.
And then, as always, if you do like what we're doing here at the National Council for History Education, please make sure to join us. You can find us on the web at www.ncheteach.org and look around. We have lots of great events coming up. Two I'd like to highlight today. The first is March 10th, of course. March 10th, we have registration is now open for Sarah Vowell. It's going to be a fantastic night. We've had a conversation with her a couple weeks ago, and she is planning some really incredible stuff for you. We're looking at, for her talk, we're really looking at history and how historians choose their topics, or people who write history choose their topics, and all the biases and problems and contradictions that they have to face in the writing process. So it should be a really, really interesting one. That'll be moderated by Leanne Potter from the Library of Congress. We're really excited to have her back for our major event. Somebody did ask, will it be recorded? Yes, it's recorded, but we do have contractual restrictions for it. So it gets a little bit tricky, but yes, it will be recorded. It will be available, I think, for at least 3 days publicly, and then possibly only for members. And it may or may not be broadcast on Facebook as well. So we're working on that. The other event, obviously, that we want to highlight is our conference, which is April 8th through the 11th. If you have not signed up, please do so, because it's going to be an amazing time. We have some incredible keynotes. John has been putting those out on social media. So please join us. There are going to be some great poster sessions, a lot of really great, interesting sessions. And then, of course, how could we forget, on April 8th at 8:30 p.m. At 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time on April 8th is a very special evening edition of History Matters and So Does Coffee, which we're calling History Matters and So Do Cocktails. So Joanne and I are feverishly looking through historical records to find the best libations to use for the evening. But it should be a fantastic event. That is a paid event, unfortunately. Actually, not unfortunately, fortunately, because Yes, it's a fundraiser for NCHE, and so we're really excited to do that. Very nominal costs. I think it's $9 if you're at the, or $8, $8 or $9 if you're at the conference, and I think 12 or 15 if you are not at the conference. So if you're not at the conference, you can absolutely join, and you can get on our website and check that out. So with that, I'm getting a little long-winded, and I want to turn it over to Joanne for our conversation today.
Excellent. And I will say, Emily, and I might mess up your last name, Emily Borowski, first time live viewer. So I must call you out and applaud. I obviously, if you say live viewer, yes, that's right. That's my students do this. That's the first time I've now done that. But yes, so anyway, welcome. We're happy to have you. Okay. And see, now Emily is being welcomed by others. Okay, so I do want to talk about the first 100 days, moving chat out of the way. Okay. Which I realize first 100 days is kind of random and actually really arbitrary and means kind of nothing. However, it is kind of a measuring post. I'm not going to measure by it, but I'm going to talk about what it does, what people have traditionally done, presidents have traditionally done with their first 100 days, and some of the reasons why they do it or don't do it and why it matters. And as I saw someone, maybe it was Tom, I can't tell, in the chat, said it began with FDR. It did indeed begin with FDR, who became president in the shadow of the Great Depression, had a lot of things to deal with. So in 1933, he just passed a slew of legislation, all kinds of things, essentially reshaping the role of government in the American economy. So he declared, declared and lifted, but still declared a national banking holiday, signed bills that provided government relief for farmers and the unemployed, and of course pushed for new federal jobs programs, some of them very well known even now by people who are not historians. And then Arthur Schlesinger made that a thing the first 100 days when he wrote about it, as though like, look at that, the first 100 days, what he accomplished. And forever after, presidents had to wrestle with that idea in some way, often thinking of it as, and I was not awake enough to jot down who said this, but at least one president called it, quote, a trap. Like, why? So for example, John F. Kennedy, even before his inauguration, said, quote, I'm sick and tired of reading how we're planning another 100 days of miracles. So he clearly isn't thrilled, like many other presidents. And then his first inaugural address, this is a quote. He talks about the things he wants to do. And then he says, all this will not be finished in the first 100 days. It's like, in case you're thinking, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin. So he really, he had no use for these random measuring sticks. Along similar lines, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson told his congressional liaison, quote, jerk out every damn little bill you can and get them down here by the 12th, and then you'll have the best 100 days. So these guys are like, really? Like people are going to mention it and it doesn't mean anything, so let's just get it over with. Now, despite the fact that there's a precedent, and in some ways what I've been talking about here and the sort of half comical quotes that I'm reading here have to do with people just being restless under the precedent, there are reasons why those first 100 days actually matter. Pragmatic reasons. So for example, a lot of presidents do enter office with a relatively high approval rating. They have not had time to destroy their relatively high approval rating. And so it's a good time to take advantage of that to get things done. So that's a pragmatic reason. And actually, some political science studies have concluded that there actually is kind of a early honeymoon for a lot of presidencies. I'm not going to say a 100-day honeymoon because that is random, but still, there is an early period for most presidencies when people are kind of waiting to see what will happen. Also, if a president takes office and has really won by a lot, like actually won by a lot, he may be able to claim realistically that he has a mandate and wants to act on that mandate and show, move this out of the way, there we go, and show that he's living up to, or she or he in the future is living up to campaign promises. And then third, on the most pragmatic level of all, presidents might have a sympathetic majority in Congress when they take office, and a few years down the road, they might not have that sympathetic majority. So that's yet another reason to at least see the beginning of a presidency as a key moment to make statements, to at least get a few things done or started in some way, and to make a loud statement to the public about what comes next. And often, and I didn't write down the statistics, but many presidents take office and then pass executive orders to do some of these things, right? To sort of signal an agenda, set the tone, prove that their campaign promises were not empty promises. And even before long before FDR, even before the first 100 days was a thing, presidents knew and acted on the fact that when they took office, they were sort of establishing who they were and what they saw their role as being, and in a sense also where they were trying to guide the nation. The most obvious example of someone who took office and those first 100 days really mattered, of course, is George Washington, because the first 100 days are the nation's first 100 days under the Constitution when it's operating in full. And Washington, this is a period I'm always particularly excited to study, only because he so deliberately and carefully went through his presidency, and particularly the early days, deliberately and loudly signaling things about what he would be as president. One of my most favorite examples of that has to do with before, I don't even know if this was before or after he was formally inaugurated, but very early on in his presidency, he apparently went from boarding house to boarding house where congressmen were staying, got off of his horse, bowed to the congressman who lived there, got back on his horse, and then went to the next boarding house. Literally a symbolic gesture to prove that he was bowing to the people's branch, that he was not going to be a king. Right? So a literal statement that he's making, I am now bowing to Congress again and again and again and again. That's actually in William Maclay's diary, which I know I quote all the time, but see, there are good reasons. Other things that he did along those lines, right? He thought about customs, he thought about style. He tried to, I've talked about this before, he tried to sort of find a happy medium between playing like the people and formal enough to be able to stand on a national, international stage with kings. And in all of those ways, he was, in a big way, setting a tone and telling people at a moment where it really mattered what a president was, what he thought the president was, how he envisioned acting within the new nation, and the tone of what the new nation may be. Now, some people were not thrilled with some of the things he did, and by his second term, he was getting criticized for some of it as being too sort of hoity-toity, and there was too much pomp and circumstance and too much formality. He was not thrilled with this. But still, he very consciously saw the early part of his presidency as making some really critical statements at a time when people didn't quite know what was going to happen, brand new government. And so that kind of declaration really mattered. Thomas Jefferson, same thing. He takes office. It's also a moment where people are really watching to see what's going to happen, because of course, the election of 1800 is the first real transition of power from one political side to another political side. And it was a really fraught election, as we have discussed on here before. And the nation was divided and there were threats of violence, and it was a difficult time. So he becomes president and sees that as a moment where he needs to, quote unquote, heal the nation, but also needs to make some statements about what he thinks the presidency is and what he thinks the nation is. And he does that right off the cuff for his inauguration. And so at the time, first, I should say, before his inauguration and even the early few days of his presidency, he's living in a boarding house in Washington with a bunch of other people. So on the day of his inauguration, he walks from his boarding house to Capitol Hill, I think, where I don't even know if it was Capitol Hill or I think it was Capitol Hill, to be inaugurated. but he walked, right? He wore plain clothes, no diamond buckles on the shoes, no grand carriage with a sword. That's Washington and Adams had more formal inaugurations, not quite monarchical, but more formal. Jefferson very pointedly wears plain clothes and walks to his inauguration, and then afterwards walks back to his boarding house where he stays for a few days. And that was a really strong statement, right? That this is not going to be more of the same. The Federalists were very much a party of monarchical pomp and circumstance. They were leading the country away from a more democratic government. So he's saying with all of these things that he's doing, and he continues to do them when he takes office, different. And you can just see that in the style that I'm leading, that I'm using here, the style that I'm dressing in, the style of what is around me in the president's house. He very pointedly, with style and performance, made it very clear that sort of what his agenda was, but more significantly, what kind of presidency he would have, what kind of president he would be, and where he would be guiding the nation. What he wanted to do right off the cuff was undo Hamilton's financial plan, but with the nation, almost up in arms, there's no way he could do that on a number of levels, but even just if he could have done it, it would have not been a way to calm the nation and bring people together. But that was certainly one of his goals. And as he went on in the presidency, even in those early days, he made clear that his goal in part was to bring down the size of the government and the sort of grand performance of the government. So that was a strong statement, and people got that statement, which is why we still know that he walked to his inauguration. That was a powerful thing to do. Now, another president whose early days were certainly marked by actions that meant a lot is, of course, Abraham Lincoln, who becomes president with a civil war looming on the horizon, and basically has to, in his early days, prepare to fight a civil war, even though things are still on the cusp. Apparently, not that long before he takes office, you have Fort Sumter exploding in controversy. He confirmed his cabinet on March 5th. On March 9th, he called them together to discuss what to do about Fort Sumter. So that's the first 4 days that he's now dealing with. Oh, the Confederates have surrounded a fort, which is running out of supplies. And should we abandon it, or should we resupply it, or what should we do? So that's a big thing to confront when you first come to office. And in his first few months in office, he increases the size of the Army and Navy. He claims some war powers. Congress for a time isn't there, so he's kind of on the scene, passing some executive orders, and Congress comes back, but still there need to be some pretty strong measures taken. So, basically within 3 weeks or so of being in office, he's commander in chief. He calls Congress into special session, and he's trying to figure out what to do. That's quite a first 100 days. So in his case, I don't think it's a trap. I think it's okay, you're now here and we're in a crisis, so go. There's no runway for that. So all of those presidents, Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, certainly Washington and Jefferson were deliberately making statements. Lincoln was addressing the crisis of the moment, I suppose, like FDR. Not all presidents, as my statements about JFK and LBJ, loved this idea, and some presidents had really dismal early days or 100 days. Maybe the most dismal of all is William Henry Harrison, who died after about 30 days in office. So I went online when I was looking to prepare for this morning, and I was rummaging around seeing what comes up when you search on first 100 days. And somewhere, I don't even remember what online journal it was in, but in one of them, it was like the best first 100 days and the worst first 100 days. And of course, at the top of the worst first 100 days was poor William Henry Harrison, who died. But still, so it's an issue that maybe has symbolic importance, that can be used, but can be, kind of a threat and a trap hanging over you as president. I think whether presidents want it to exist or not, they're sort of confronted with it. I mean, people are already talking, about President Biden's first 100 days and what is he accomplishing and how many executive acts, and is that typical of a president's first 100 days? Like some other presidents, he's assumed office at a moment of crisis. That complicates matters. He has to deal with that. And as with presidents who take office during a crisis, sometimes that means you can get a lot of things done. Sometimes, newbie really has a lot to say about presidential agendas. I don't know what set him off. I hear you, noobs. I really do. Okay, that's good. He had to weigh in. You're his audience. That Biden, has taken office at a time where there are a number of crises. Sometimes that means you can accomplish a lot of things. Sometimes that means you have to address emergency situations or budgets or other things that aren't as splashy, but that are important. So again, first 100 days is very arbitrary and ultimately not very useful, but I mentioned it now and wanted to do it now because I think, particularly given the controversial nature of the last presidency, everyone is watching. People who like President Biden, people who don't like President Biden are watching to see what these early days mean. And of course, given how partisan we are and how divided we are, people have been sort of attacking him for what he did in the first 3 days, or the first 5 days. Like, why hasn't he done this yet? And then people say, because he's been in office a week. So, measurements, using time as a measurement of a president is longstanding, but one of the reasons why I raised this today is because I think I want to bring to everyone's consciousness the fact that ultimately it's not a really useful tool of measurement, and particularly now when everyone is sort of counting days. I think when a president takes office, they're concerned with, and in this case, crises and the kind of presidency he'll have. What he does matters. People are watching, but also he can't simply do, and I keep saying he, and I really want to say she, and someday I will. But still, I raise this today because I want us to be conscious of the fact that that's so arbitrary, and that never mind putting pressure on a president, but we put ourselves into an additional crisis mentality of sorts if we start measuring, it's day 80 and he hasn't done X yet, or now this is going to be this kind of presidency. I guess I'm encouraging us all to, as I've always said, to watch closely, to think about what a president is doing, to look at a president's words and actions, to think about implications, but also to recognize it's the beginning of a presidency and put that all into the balance when you're evaluating what's happening. We're in a really interesting time, and I'm sure some of you must be feeling this along with me, that I've been in one kind of a crisis mentality for years, and now I'm in a slightly different crisis mentality, but it's still a crisis mentality. And it's very hard. I guess that's part of the reason why we're here as a community. It's very hard to judge things realistically and calmly and with historical context guiding you when you're in a moment when it feels right where we started, highly contingent, right? Our first episode was about contingency, and we are living in hyper contingent times. That makes it hard to do everything for people in office and people like us out of office watching to see what happens. So all of this I raise because I will encourage you, and you can then encourage me, to take a breath and see what's happening before we pounce on it. Not to necessarily turn our backs. I don't think you should do that with any president. But I think we should be thinking in the moment and not allowing the history of crisis mentality to shape our new crisis mentality, which needs to be different, which needs to be focused in this situation, and needs to allow for both agenda setting and the possibility of change. I think I'll stop there since we're close to being the end, but that's the main point I wanted to make, because yesterday when I realized with a jolt that I hadn't thought of anything to talk about for today, that's the first thing that leapt to mind, because I have historian friends and others who already are talking about the first 100 days. And I suppose if you mentioned them to me, if we were chatting, I would immediately leap on that and think, what day are we on? It's a hard thing, it's an obvious thing to say, but the president is an office of power and an office of performance and ceremony. And you have to keep both of those balls in the air at the same time as a president. And depending on the circumstances when you take office, there might be extreme demands on the level of power and on the level of performance. And you need to think about, as we have for the last X number of years, think about a presidency and think about politics on both levels, because they do matter. So, okay, I will pause because I want to open things up. I want us to be able to talk. So yeah, Carolee, I don't even, the mug, I was gonna say, I moved chat out of the way. Those of you who are new to History Matters and So Does Coffee, this is the And So Does Coffee part. Every week, we've been doing this almost a year, close, and every week I have used, maybe not a different mug, almost every week I've used a different mug, but every week I have a mug that in some way or another touches on the topic that we're talking about, and Matt has a background that relates to the topic we're talking about. Now, this today's mug might be a bit of a stretch. Like, the fact that for 100 times, however long we've been doing this for over the course of the 100 days, over the course of the last year that I've kept managing to come up with a mug, I feel a sense of accomplishment. But sometimes the stretch is greater than others. So, and I do have three or four Hamilton mugs. So this is actually a mug from the Hamilton exhibition that was in Chicago for a short time that I was a historical consultant for. And it says, "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" And I picked it because, in a sense, those first 100 days, people are trying to construct a story around a presidency. And the president doesn't necessarily get to write that story. People who are watching get to write the story. So I think that's a pretty good connection. Maybe his arbiter is 100 days, but not bad for someone rummaging through a cabinet trying desperately to find a mug that suits the purpose. Okay, so I will now allow shift things here. Matt?
Yes, and somebody did get it. I think it was Inger who got it, and God, I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Excellent. I have to move the chat out of the way because I start to get very focused on what people are saying, and then I forget I'm supposed to say things. But anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So this is of course, and if I move this, you'll see it becomes very obvious what this is. This is FDR's study at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Our friends there, thank you for letting me borrow your picture for the day. But very, very apropos, as you said, that he is sort of the creator of the 100 days phenomenon. And of course, he probably did as much, if not more, in the first 100 days than many other presidents. So I thought that was appropriate for the day.
It's excellent. And I don't know if I would have absolutely guessed that, but it's perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. I picked a picture where where his wheelchair would be out of would be hidden. So that would,
which is always a fascinating part of his presidency, is the way that the press worked with him to not make that apparent.
Yeah.
That really feels like another planet, but that's always a striking part about FDR. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I will stop. And so we can open things up for a conversation.
Okay. So all kinds of good questions here. And you touched on this, but I wondered if you had any other expansion on it. Natalie wants to know, how is the first 100 days a predictor of how a president will govern for the rest of his or her term? I'm going to say her because maybe someday.
Not maybe, definitely.
Definitely someday. Hopefully someday. For example, let's see. I'm going to skip that. But so the question is the first 100 days a predictor of what happens after the first 100 days, in your estimation, historically, of course?
Well, I mean, speaking sweepingly about all presidencies, I don't think you could say it's a predictor because some parts of it are so symbolic in nature. One way in which it might be revealing is in the nature of how a president operates in that time. So what a president does may or may not ultimately represent what he or she does, but the way in which they operate, how, who do they choose to be around them? How do they interact with Congress? You can learn a lot about what a president is like and how a president is going to work in operation, which then will dramatically shape what can or can't happen in those first 100 days. So, I guess it goes back to what I was saying at the end of my comments. Like everyone else, I'm watching what's going on now and trying to decide what it means about what's to come. It's natural to do that. But what I'm most focused on at the moment is sort of how the president is working with others and how that is or isn't working and what that suggests about the ongoing dynamic of the government in operation down the road.
So Dave does not ask a question in any way, shape, or form. It's actually like 4 sentences, but I think it leads us into a good area to talk about. And he says, given the limit on what the president can actually do in the first 100 days, it seems unimportant to me. The president can set the tone. Congress passes the laws. The executive enforces the laws. That's the statement from Dave. And so but as I read that, I think back to your comments about Lincoln, right? Like, how does that first 100 days really do set the tone? And you mentioned a lot of the sort of the ceremonial aspects of it and sort of the bridge building aspects of it. But one of the things that strikes me, especially in the last 4 or 5 presidents, about how they used that first 100 days to build a foundation for their commitments for the rest of their presidencies. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit on that from your perspective as a historian, that, how did Washington, for example, use that sort of, or as you said, he used it in a very deliberate way. What were the effects of that? And I don't know if you could comment a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, I think it had a big effect. And the way you can tell that in any case, and this would be true in 1789 as it's true thereafter, is by reading the press response, right? I mean, in the case of historians, we can dig through people's diaries and personal correspondence, which I love to do. But the best way to get a measure of the impact of what a president is doing is to read how the press is performing that to the public. In Washington's case, initially, people really, during his first term, really did kind of give him a little chance to kind of state what he was doing and how he was going to do it and allow for that in time and before his second term, but definitely during his second term. What he was doing did not necessarily have the impact he meant it to have. Why? Because you were getting the development of a real partisan split, and people who were not in agreement with him politically were seeing and interpreting what he did in ways that conformed with what they were mostly afraid of and what they mostly wanted. So I guess that's the short version of that is a president can do what a president can do, and then partisanship may shape it to an extreme degree how that comes across, what happens after that, and what the implications are.
Mm-hmm. And so that leads into Jennifer's question, which is, why has the first 100 days become such a thing for just the presidency? And her question really is, why don't we also discuss this for Congress, the first 100 days of a new presidency with Congress? And we're seeing some of that play out now. And as you mentioned, with some of our, FDR, Lincoln, and Washington, Thomas Jefferson, that we saw this play out in this sort of, as you mentioned, political relationship between the presidency and Congress, but also Congress having this sort of larger legislative role in that first 100 days. And maybe this is a good opportunity to turn towards that a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think it's a multi-part answer.
We got time.
And thanks. And some parts of it are not going to be sweepingly satisfying, but I think Americans know in the case of Congress and don't necessarily know in the case of a president because of executive orders. Anything that Congress does takes a long time. So I think number one, people don't assume Congress can do things instantly. So there's a certain allowance for the 100 days not mattering so much. I also feel like the beginnings of a Congress, there's so much organization going on before real action can happen that also, I don't know how many days you can say that takes up, but it takes up a certain number of days. Now, all of that said, I think it would be interesting to ask that of legislatures, and maybe not to inflict the 100 days measurement on Congresses, but to really think about what a new Congress is suggesting about its goals and its dynamics and how it's going to work. That would be worth doing. And, you know, the Americans have been looking at the president as the marker of a time for the 20th century, much of the 20th century. In much of the 19th century, it was Congress that people were looking to first and foremost, not so much the presidency. And it would be interesting, I haven't done this, but it would be interesting to go back and see if at that moment, when newspapers really were filled, the column inches of newspapers were packed with discussions of what Congress was saying, sort of just accounts of what were said, op-eds on Congress. I mean, Congress filled newspapers. It would be interesting to go back and look at some of those newspapers, kind of to review them in a general way and see if, not necessarily 100 days, but if there were these kind of pronouncements and predictions. Well, this Congress, you know, looks like this, and we expect this, and the kind of measurement that we impose upon presidents. And you're right, whoever asked the question, we don't necessarily inflict upon Congresses. So that's totally true.
Tom McAndrew. So we have multiple Toms that come regularly. So this is Tom McAndrew's question. It's a very particular question, so I don't know if you can answer it, but it's an interesting one. So Tom would like to know, John Quincy Adams is one of the more accomplished individuals that we elected president. I haven't done much research on him. That's him saying it, but I also have not done much research on John Quincy Adams. What were his first 100 days like? Do you have any sense of what John Quincy Adams was like entering his presidency?
Which is a really good question. And I'm not going to be able to lay out like, well, on day 5, he did this. But what I can say is, you know, he ran for office with a kind of vision of, you know, encouraging learning and points of light. And, you know, he ran for office on a real vision of what the nation could be. His presidency was not horrible, but he wasn't particularly effective. I mean, there's a reason why the 2 one-termers in the early presidencies are both Adamses, right? Because the Adamses, they're like independent thinkers. They do what they want. They don't go by party lines. They have a habit of ticking people off. They punch holes in every balloon of pretension, you know, they're that guy. But in both cases, I think they felt somewhat disappointed in how their presidency went. So I don't know specifically what happened in his first 100 days. What I can say is that however many days, you know, if you add up all of the years that he was there, I don't think he felt particularly successful. And I don't think the highlight of his career really is after his presidency, when he goes to the House, when he goes to Congress. And he, you know, one of the things I liked is too soft a word. I loved writing about many things in the last book I wrote. And one of those things was, you know, just John Quincy Adams in Congress. And being an ex-president mattered in Congress, right? He was an ex-president and the son of a founder and an elderly man. And on all those levels, he was kind of, I always use the phrase bulletproof, which is kind of horrible because they actually had guns in Congress at that point, but still, that gave him real power. So ironically, the presidency was most significant for him after the presidency. But that would be an interesting thing it would be interesting, and I did not have the time to do it, but it would be interesting to march through presidencies and just very quickly sum up what happens in let's say the first 3 months, so that we break away from the 100 days thing and just sort of see. There are studies online, and I saw one, but I did not take note of it, that, for example, It lists the number of executive orders of every presidency. So there are already political scientists sort of taking those accounts, but pretty much for key presidents, the ones you would expect, you know, Reagan, Clinton, Bush's, et cetera, et cetera. But that would be someone out there, some student or teacher out there. It would be really another interesting thing, another project, right? Go to the newspapers and see how people are judging Congress at the time when Congress is at the center of news, and see what those first days look like for the presidents and really measure them against each other, which kind of, to some degree, won't mean a lot since the times are so different.
Yeah,
but still might be interesting to look at.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Is, I mean, it would be fascinating, but the hard part would be the comparison in terms of,
Exactly.
and especially sort of the saliency of the first 100 days in the contemporary era versus when, in the 19th century, where, stuff was happening, but people were sort of going about their daily lives. There wasn't like, 24-hour cable news that they could, where it increased sort of the, I don't know, not importance or significance, because those are bad words, but the impact of them. Yeah, I agree. So,
and actually, have we talked about technology?
Not explicitly. We've talked about newspapers, we've talked about photographs, but we have not talked about technology explicitly.
I may have a topic for next week, depending on what the news cycle looks like. I know. Oh
my gosh. 7 days?
It's shocking, because one of the things that really fascinated me, again, in writing the book in this particular moment, I was interested in seeing how the telegraph shaped politics, and then social media. There are so many similar things about the two that and other things as well, that I've become really fascinated at just thinking about how technology shapes democracy at various points. So I'll see, but this might be the first time ever that there's a full week about what I'm going to talk about. I don't know, but I find that fascinating. I think there was a uncontrolled, what do I want to call it? Like a protest in the House, and they shut down the cameras. And so people, members of the House, were showing what was happening through their cell phones. Like that. I just sat and watched that whole thing, because having always been someone interested in technology and the link between the public and politicians, that was like watching history happen to me. It blew my mind. So anyway, that's right, a full week to think about the mug. That's true. Although I kind of already know which one I would use. Look at that. I might have a mug and a topic already. This is shocking. Okay. I'll stop talking about next week, but that very well might be what I talk about.
Oh my goodness. I've already got some background ideas, so I'm going to have to, I could have some fun. This could be really exciting, but yeah, I think, and from a historical perspective, right? Like we've covered newspapers. We've talked about it. We talk about how newspapers in the colonial early American era were used in some ways, and very similarly to how tweets and social media in some ways is used today as a mechanism for pushing social conversation in a particular direction. And so that could be really interesting.
Carolee wants to know what we'll do with all of our spare time if we have a background, a topic, and a mug.
I don't know. I have nothing else going on in my life, so I could.
It means my Wednesdays will be calmer, because I won't be panicking about what I'm going to talk about. So anyway, that's right. Plan for the cocktail party. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's open it up.
No, this is good. But there was a question that I saw float through chat. One of the rare opportunities that I caught it in time but I think it's a good question, and I didn't see it in these other questions that folks have submitted, which I will get back to, I promise. So I'm not going too rogue here, but somebody asked about the departments, the executive departments, and I can't remember who it was. That there was and it made me think of what you're saying about Washington being, in the sort of really deliberate way that he conducted it, because he was very aware of the historical significance of what was going on, right? And it made me, the cabinet he picked and it was a small cabinet. It's not like what we have today, but the individuals he picked he did that very deliberately too, I think, right? So I wonder how does that sort of, that example or other examples that you're aware of, um, demonstrate how a president will use his, and hopefully soon her, cabinet as a way of pushing a 100-day or an early presidency agenda.
Well, and you're right, as you're suggesting at the outset of the question, that the simple choice is a strong statement. And, we can see this now by just the diversity in the people that President Biden is appointing. That in and of itself is a statement of change and a statement of purpose. So, I think the choice matters. And then I think this is going to sound very sort of general and sweeping and thus not very useful, but I do think the public interaction with political choices and how it's covered by the press and how the people who have that kind of power interact with the press matter to such an extreme degree that I think that's another way in which those choices can not necessarily set an agenda, but set the appearance of an agenda, right? And that's the part of what we're talking about here. Is things that are being done in and of themselves have an impact, but they also signal things, and that you have to be thinking on both levels, obviously, if you have high office, and particularly the presidency, and that's just as true in your cabinet choice as anything else. It's also true that the way you operate with your cabinet, I need more coffee. The way that you interact with your cabinet as president also can say a lot. That was harder to see in the early period. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson liked very much to meet separately with his cabinet members and then basically forge an agreement and then bring them all together. It's like, my cabinet agrees. He just didn't want to deal with the conflict. You have the kitchen cabinet of Andrew Jackson. There are all kinds of ways in which people interact with their cabinet that actually say a lot about their style of leadership, but those aren't necessarily always visible to the public. So I think that is a layered answer. There are different ways in which you can answer that question.
And forgive me, this is something I guess I've never thought to look into. Maybe are there some presidents that have used their cabinet to push legislative acts more than relying on Congress? Or like, for example, is there a president that said, okay, let's use Hamilton as the example in the National Bank, right? That, now Washington really made it a point that be part of, a congressional decision, whereas maybe there's another president who made fiscal policy sort of through the Treasury Department. I think we can think of maybe a couple throughout at least modern history that have really used to make fiscal policy, not the FEC. That I'm blanking on the alphabet soup. But that use sort of executive offices to shape policy and sort of bypass Congress. Can you talk a little bit about that, or is that sort of?
Yeah, no, I certainly, for sure, in the periods that I really study in depth, that's kind of a two-part way, at least two parts. I feel it's such a historian thing to say either that's complex or, there are three answers to that question. In this case, if you're talking about the cabinet shaping legislative policy, that can be answered in part with how a president deploys a cabinet. That can also be answered in part with how cabinet members individually act and interact. So, for example, even just looking at Washington's presidency, Washington at least once, and probably more than once, positioned members of his cabinet outside the hall where Congress was meeting when something particularly controversial was up for debate, so they could nab legislators and sort of pin them down and talk about things, right? So that's these people didn't necessarily do that on their own volition. That's something that was a sort of agreed upon, like, let's go, guys, kind of president using his cabinet to have an impact of some kind on Congress. Hamilton, if getting into the realm of just personality of individuals, Hamilton sometimes attended committee meetings like that had to do with finance. I remember years ago researching my first book, and there's the wonderful first Congress project that was at GW and the wonderful staff of people there. And I spent a big chunk of time researching there. And while I was there, one of the wonderful people who works there is named Ken Bowling. Ken came to me with a committee, something from a committee report. And he said to me, does this look like Hamilton's handwriting to you? He was trying to determine if Hamilton had actually been in the meeting directing people. That would be totally in character. That would also be somewhat shocking by different people's standards. But that's a case in which I do not think Washington said, hey, Hamilton, go sit in on the meeting. Hamilton, being Hamilton, said, well, I know this better than anyone, and I know what should happen, and I'll just go, insert myself into that process. So I think the answer has multiple parts. There are others, other cabinet members in other times who are Hamilton equivalents, who probably inserted themselves in a way that did not necessarily get requested by a president. And then there are surely many cases in which a cabinet and a president agree on a strategy to approach the legislature and have some kind of an impact.
Yeah, the one that stands out to me, and I know you're not a directly Civil War, but Stanton always stands out to me as somebody who, as the Secretary of War during the Civil War, as somebody that, and of course there's lots written about Lincoln's cabinet, so I don't want to belabor that, but I just, that's the kind of thing that is in a similar way to I don't know, maybe not similar to Hamilton, but at least in a very prominent way with what's going on in the country. This executive office carried a lot of significance and weight in the decisions that were being made.
Right. Which also does get to the individual, the personality and drive and agenda of individual members matters a lot too.
Well, we only have a couple more minutes, and I do have 2 more questions for you. So
I have seen several people now remind us of the parliamentarian.
That's the last question I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
I will come back to that, I promise.
Okay.
So Gina asks a really good question for us to sort of end the conversation about the first 100 days, which is, do second term first 100 days get any attention? It doesn't seem like they get, but do they?
Interesting. Definitely not like the first 100 days. And obviously second terms have a lot of baggage when they start, right? There's the whole first term and whatever was good and bad about it sitting as baggage with second terms. And a lot of presidents, Washington's second term, he did not love and he was criticized. Jefferson's second term, he got a lot of criticism. He did some controversial things in that second term. So I think second terms become complicated in part because you have to also deal with what you yourself did or allowed to happen before. And then, after Washington set the example of not staying in office for more than 2 terms, pretty much everyone else knew that then they were only going to stay in office for 2 terms, since that wasn't determined until much later. That means that people assumed that, okay, well, this is my last go round. That shapes what happens in that, later part of a presidency as well. And we all know how in any office, lame duckness, even with a president who hopefully is, wants to promote his party's candidate for president, still, if you know you're no longer running for president, that kind of frees you up to do things. So second terms, I think, are complicated. And it would also be a very interesting thing to march through time for those who got a second term and kind of see who had a really successful, with the public loving you, second term versus like Washington and Jefferson, and who the public just came down on their head during their second terms.
So sounds like a topic for 2 weeks from now.
Second terms. Yeah.
All right. So the last question, which Dave asked earlier, which is how important are parliamentarians? How important have parliamentarians been historically? And so I'm going to break this into two parts. The first is let's talk briefly about parliamentary procedure and its significance to our government, and the role of the parliamentarian, what that role is, and then we can answer the question of how important has it been historically.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yes, I might not answer it in that order, but it'll all be mixed in.
It'll all be in there. Okay, good.
So one of the first things to say that's important along those lines is that parliamentary precedent very often is not being deployed objectively, consistently. Very often it's driven by agenda, who's in power, who isn't in power. And you can see that, throughout time. You can see that in the course of working on my most recent book. Benjamin Brown French, the House clerk who I wrote about. Very often he's consulted on parliamentary questions when he's clerk of the House. And very often he's being asked by people who really want something to happen and they want it badly and they want him to be able to enable it to happen. And sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't do what these people want, but they push through anyway. The biggest lesson that I had in working on well, I won't say the biggest lesson, that's very unhistorian-like of me. A huge lesson that I had in my last book was the degree to which parliamentary rules can be enforced, but can be totally manipulated or ignored, depending on who allows that to happen. So, if you think about the fact that I wrote a book that has between 1830 and 1860, over 70 physically violent incidents in Congress, that is not parliamentary, right? Nothing about that should be happening. And above and beyond those are all of these other instances with name calling and many other things that are not supposed to happen in either the House or the Senate. And they do usually without any kind of punishment. That right there shows you that although there are parliamentary standards and precedents and rules, although there are rules set at the beginning of Congresses, it's not so much the existence, but the enforcement that matters. We're in another moment where we can see that, right? We're talking all the time about guns on the floor. That's a big issue. I have a lot to say on that issue, which I will not say here. But what matters right now is how is that enforced, or is it? Because that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, right? It's about enforcement. So the thing about parliamentarians, and I've already seen people making this kind of claim about the current moment. Some people are saying that a parliamentarian saying, no, you cannot attach this to this bill. You cannot have minimum wage attached. Some are saying, well, that's a really handy way to bypass the fact that maybe you're not going to be able to do that at all. And so you can say, well, this isn't about Democrats not having enough power to do it. It's not about their agenda having any problem. Officially speaking, we can't do this. So that's a sort of longhand way of making the shorthand point about this, which is that parliamentary processes and a parliamentarian sort of weighing in, sometimes that has extreme power. Actually, John Quincy Adams is a guy who used parliamentary precedent and rules with real effectiveness. He knew them better than probably anyone else in the House at the time. And if he stood up and said, the rules say this, it could be hard to combat that. Most people did not have that kind of skill and facility with the rules. So things would happen. And sometimes someone would say, hey, isn't that not allowed? Not the same impact. So parliamentarianism can be partisan, I guess is part of what I'm saying. And enforcement can matter more than the rules themselves. At this particular moment, I can't judge yet what's going on with minimum wage and this question. But it's a thing to watch for, is to see what the actual politics of this moment suggest versus what is allowable or not allowable, and to what degree is that really the case. And I don't know.
Yeah, and just to say that the same thing came up in the last administration as well. Right. That the role of the parliamentarian, and I think they fired one of them at one point.
And Catherine makes the point that, the way I'm explaining the deployment of parliamentary power, it sounds kind of like a cop-out. I guess that's part of my point, is it can be deployed that way. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's the case right now, but rules only matter as they're enforced, or if they're enforced. So the enforcement of rules can be just as partisan as anything else, even though it seems like it shouldn't be.
Well, that seems like a terrific place to stop for the day. So I'll let you say your last little bit after I say thanks everybody for being here. Thank you for joining us, and on behalf of the National Council for History Education, we're delighted as always to have these Fridays with you. If you do like what we do, please join us at www.ncheteach.org or on social media. We are at History Ed on Twitter and at NC4, the number 4, HE on Facebook. And then we also do have an Instagram account, which we're trying to use more. We're also have a LinkedIn account, which you can always find, and some LinkedIn groups even. So we are extending our tendrils into all things social media. So please come find us, join us, engage with us. That's what we're looking for. And just a couple of reminders again, we have Saraval coming up on March 10th. We have our conference March 8th April 8th to 11th. We have our special episode of History Matters and So Do Cocktails at 8:30 p.m. on April 8th. That is a fundraiser for NCHE, so please join us for that. And we'll be announcing a lot of new programming in the next few weeks, months. Okay. So keep an eye on us because we have a lot going on behind the scenes, which is not quite ready for prime time, but it soon will be, and we're really excited about some of the work we're doing.
Okay, excellent.
Turn it back to Joanne.
As Matt did, Newbie and I want to thank you for coming and being part of this history community where we're hashing through things past and present in a way that I think matters. We may indeed talk about technology and democracy next week. I'm not sure, but I'm kind of shocked that I even have an idea about what I might be talking about next week. Actually, if you have ideas about things that you want to talk about, you should always feel free you could tweet them or send them to Matt or I, and we certainly would look at them and consider them. What we are now headed into, for those of you who are new, is the after party. And what we do every week is, after the hour in which we have my comments and then a discussion about the topic, is we stop recording and we go into a more informal mode where we just kind of talk. Usually about history related things, but it's fun. It's just the community in another tone. If you're on Facebook, I think you need to go and join this through the website, correct?
Yep.
NCHE Teach.
www.ncheteach.org/conversations. Click on Joanne's face and you can find us.
Click on my face. I'm not even going to go there. I just thought I thought of a song from the 70s or 80s, and I'm not going to do it, which might be a Monty Python song, actually. Anyway, I'm going to stop. But no, I'm not going to sing. Just think Monty Python. At any rate, so we're going to head into the after party. Please join us if you would like. And if not, Matt and I will see you all next week. Have a good week. Stay safe and see you soon.